I'll do the share thing just so it jumps up in the screen. Hopefully you can see that. All thumbs up.
They're very old photos.
Well,
like
mine's probably older than yours.
Yeah, we need to change those.
I guess we'll just do a quick little intro of ourselves so everybody knows. Not everybody knows us, I suppose. Tony Ponton. I have been doing the Agile thing since about 1999. Grew up in Suncorp. A couple of you I know. Mark, we've had the pleasure of working there together. And we're doing this governing and governance thing as part and parcel of that over the last 3 decades as well. Phil.
Yeah, so obviously I'm not as old as Tony, if you didn't guess, but I kicked off kind of my Agile career journey in software development and software delivery teams starting in about 2006. So my background from there was in Agile projects, programs, and then ultimately into transformation. The last couple of years, I've actually been running an enterprise portfolio at my employer. So applying all the things that we're going to talk about and just seeing how they work in action. It's kind of what we've been focusing on the last couple of years. But I did also work with Tony before that at Elaborate. And I guess some of the ideas that form the basis of what we've written were things that we've done in practice with different organizations. So kind of learned by doing, which obviously is a very good Agile ethos as well. And then turned it into something where we think there's a bit of value in it.
Yeah.
Thanks for having us.
No, I guess the genesis or the origin of the book, as Phil says, is ground into, all of those things that we've experienced. We've been seeing these repetitive patterns across the world. We've been very lucky to work not just in Australia, but across organisations across the world. And those repetitive patterns kept coming up. And so then we started experimenting with particular ways to deal with that in terms of the governing of the system. So that's the genesis of the book. And the other genesis, of course, was COVID and far too much alcohol while it was locked down and talking to each other over Zoom. And someone said, you should write a book. And the drunken thing of, we should write a book. And 2.5 years later, here we are.
It kind of did, didn't we? You get a lot of time. I don't know what Perth. I remember Perth had no lockdowns, I think. But we seem to be in lockdown for about nearly 2 years, almost straight. So what do you do of an evening? So I think we rolled out the whiskey and started talking about the things we've been working on, and what are those patterns that Tony mentioned? What are the things that we see that are common, and how have we tackled that in our work in the past? But then how do you actually turn that into something that you could share? And that's kind of led us to the book and the 5 stanchions. I think normally we'd probably have a bit of a like workshop talk, which is maybe a bit boring, where we'll just go through a bunch of slides. But I don't think we'll do that tonight. We'll just bounce off some ideas and talk about where we've come from and maybe the stanchions themselves. And we'll talk to you about what a stanchion means, because that took a long time to get to. But the ideas that sit behind it, why those 5 things sort of matter, how they come together, how we use them in practice. So I think maybe that could be our focus. But also as we're going along, feel free, jump in, raise a hand, ask a question. Let's try and treat it as if we were there.
Cool. All right, well, I will throw a few slides up there, obviously. Okay. So I think, there's no good Agile talk in the world that hasn't started with VUCA, right? And probably preaching the choir, we want to talk about VUCA. But we do like to preface it with the reason that we talk about governing the systems and governance in the way that we do is exactly that quote from Alistair Cockburn, right? Your traditional plans and your traditional way of governing systems and the traditional projects and PMI methods of planning, they just fit for purpose in the world that we actually deal with now. It's too fast. It will not sit. It doesn't behave the way we think it's going to be, and it's going to change. So when we think about it, and when I say we, Phil and I, in terms of what we talk about when we talk about the book, we think about it a little bit. I like to think a little bit more differently, or a little bit more in depth. And we think of it as extrinsic and intrinsic factors. So what I mean by that is that everybody knows the VUCA out there, and everybody hears the volatility setting, etc. But what about what VUCA does to the inside of your organisation and the intrinsic changes that it actually creates within your organisation? Phil, you've got some thoughts on that.
Yeah, Nothing's stable. It's kind of interesting. We set up sort of systems of work and systems of governance and systems of operations and all the things we do with this expectation that everything will be stable. But yet we're constantly changing that. So a really good example. So it's part of my new role. It's been about 12 months now, so it's not really that new. Is I actually have a key role in the annual planning process. So that annual planning process actually takes us about 18 months to execute. So it's probably a little bit more than an annual planning process. But as we start defining it, working collaboratively, trying to create how we want to work and operate, every time it hits a different person with a different idea or a different business unit, something changes. Like we learn something new or something shifts or there's an outcome that we didn't expect or there's a process that hasn't quite aligned. And so although we've locked these what we think are clear steps and actions, over a long period of time, as soon as it hits people, it moves because people are linear and non-linear and unpredictable. So no matter what you plan for, there's always going to be something you need to adjust against. So that's the internal stuff, and I think it's things like how we set up for the flow of work that comes to our team, how we set up for information that we're receiving from outside to the market that comes to our team. So that interplay of both things coming in, affecting our plan, and then coming back out again. It's definitely not stable. So if we think about stability, I think we used to have, anyone know a guy called Rob Thompson? Rob's been around the traps for a long time. Pete, yes. I used to work with Rob at NAB, and he wrote, I think it was Extreme Project Management and a couple of other books, Radical Project Management. And some of the things that he was talking about there is something we still think about now, is that the windows of stability used to be like 2, 3, 4 years long. You could actually have an annual planning cycle that went for a year or 18 months. You could actually have a vision that went out 3 to 5 years. It's now more like 6 months, if you're lucky. So one of the organizations I used to work with, we went through our annual planning cycle, came up with our approach, got it all set, planned out $1 billion worth of work. Within 3 months, we had to pivot 3/4 of the plan because there was just too much volatility and difference coming in from the market. So that stability that we used to plan for and think is actually gone as a result of sort of that VUCA element that we see globally.
So sort of just to tie a bow on that, I like to use the Jack Welch quote, right? Because you're hanging your archetypal and traditional systems off this stability, but the reality is the Jack Welch quote plays into this, is that if the rate of change on the inside of your organization is not greater than the change on the outside of your organization, you're losing. So why do we keep using these stable sedimentary planning methods and wondering why we're not getting where we need to go? I'm probably preaching converted to a bunch of agilists, but it's sort of setting the tone of our thoughts, right? So, sorry, you had something.
Well, I was going to jump in. We're going to have some other recent examples that even small change is extremely challenging inside a large-scale organization. We kind of end up exerting more energy to maintain the thing and the way we do the thing today than it is to shift to something else, even though we know it's probably going to be better. And we see that play out kind of over and over again. For that, we think about agility, it's all about change management. It's all about risk management and change management. But our organizational systems are so stuck, and it's super challenging to move them. So much energy goes into it. Sorry, Tony, what did you do?
Oh, that's fine. And so we know, and obviously we're talking to a group of agilists here as well. We know agility came along and changed that paradigm, right? And that was meant to be the way that we reacted and were able and are able to react to VUCA. And, finally we created that business agility. The problem with that is, and I'm going to say this a couple of times, and then, you can get the pitchforks out, but we as agilists actually left the things behind that we actually needed to deal with, because it was easier to apply agility in the way that we were doing it at the levels we'll do it. And we'll qualify that a little bit before you get the pitchforks out for me. But it means we've got to change how we govern the system as a whole. So I just want to put that premise when we're talking about governance, and we'll reiterate that a few times. We're talking about not just your PMOs and your projects and program officers and value management officers and value officer, and all the new kitsch names that they like to
All
call
the officers.
all the officers. We're talking about how you govern the system as a whole, the whole system of your organizational construct. And I think that's really important to put in, context there.
Yeah, definitely. I got transformation management office today as well, so I've kind of added a new one. So,
What is the Office of Transformation?
oh, I don't know anyway. We dealt with it.
All right, just keen. All right. So if we do that, first thing, I guess, is you're going to define what governance is, because everybody has this thing about, well, governance means this, governance means that. So we tend to use this particular version of it, which is, I'm not going to read through that, but you can see it's about those mechanisms of theoretically keeping people accountable in their work and their outcomes and the processes. But the piece that people miss in that definition, the entire system with which an organization operates. And I think that's, we'll talk a little bit about that, because our version of governing the system, as I'm going to say again, is about an entire governing mechanism. So pull ourselves away from just projects, pull ourselves away from those things in the portfolios. We want to start thinking about governance as an entire system.
Yeah, and I think it's important as well, because we used to be able to very distinctly separate change and run. And like, we still go through that debate a lot. Like, should it be separate? My investment slate's here, but I run my things there. If you've got a product team or a persistent team or a crew or a tribe, whatever you've got, it's a combination of change and run. You got to run the thing, you got to change the thing. So people are organized around outcomes. And it's distinctly different to the way we used to set ourselves up. So to actually govern that new system of delivery and work and the way that we want to solve problems for customers, we have to have a more holistic view. Processes, programs, projects are just the start, whatever it be. The source of the thing is just the start. It's how we combine the execution elements. And I think when we talk about agile governance or governance, that's the bit that hasn't quite caught up. And we'll talk about that as we go through, but we still govern as if investment and change was separate. It's just a thing over there. Yet everything we do is so intertwined at a system level because of the complexity that we have in large-scale organizations and the architectural dependencies. I think most companies that are legacy companies rather than sort of digital natives are extremely architecturally integrated. So with architectural integration, you're increasing your complexity, which means when you're governing change, it's a systemic view rather than an isolated view.
Yeah. So what's agile governance? Obviously, we have to talk about what we believe agile governance is, right? So obviously that's taking the values and principles of agility and the way we govern an organization, and ensuring those mechanisms and strategies and delivery methods of the entire company are nimble and adaptive. That's a fairly big statement there, right? If you take a few moments on that and you think, well, yeah, that's no brainer. We know that stuff, but my rhetorical question to you, don't have to answer me, is, are we doing that? Are organizations doing that? Now, I can give you some examples. There are some, but in general, most organizations are not doing that. What they're actually doing is applying governance to their agility rather than agility to their governance. And then they wonder why they're having a problem with their organization. And that sort of brings us to my little thing before, is we as agilists, not just us, obviously, organizations, leaders, guiding boards, we left governance behind. And there's a reason that was done, but now it's coming back to bite us. And we like to talk about that a little bit more in depth, is the fact that governance is that forgotten element, right? They've been adopting the new operating models. They're based on enabling agility, and they think they've got more adaptable systems of work. So let's think about it, right? We've had the Spotify model, or we've had everybody's seen somebody come to your organization say, I've got this and it's going to fix all of your problems, right? And as I say to everybody, run and keep running and don't look back. You actually have to design to the context of your organization and make it adaptable to systems of work to enable your agility. Phil, you got it.
Yeah, I think, so Will, you were talking a bit earlier about the RAF approach, the remote agility framework approach. just kind of your Clayton's framework. It's the framework you've got when you don't have a framework. The whole idea is actually, what's the process you want to follow to get to your operating model? Rather than here's an operating model, let's design a process to get to that. And that's distinctly different. And we've tried to sort of bake that in when we think about RAF, when we think about agility, we think about governance, because every system of work is not fundamentally, because people and problems are generally the same, but every system of work needs to be purposefully designed to solve for the problems of that system of work. Otherwise, you actually don't get that adaptability that you're after. So we invest in agility, we invest in transformation, but we end up not really getting large-scale organizational results because of the approaches that we take to get to that.
And that leads us to my favorite part.
Tony.
So why do we need, what's the compelling thing that we need governing with agility, and why do we just put all of that context in it? It's because what we see is organizations repeatedly doing this and they apply agility. They start out with this goal of being transformational. The amount of transformations I walk into, and they're going to be transformation, I hear the word transformation. What they actually end up being is transitional. What do I mean by that? So what I mean by transitional is they affect the flow, where the workflow happens. So pods, squads, tribes, streams.
Crews now. We've got crews, Tony. We're on to crews.
Crews now.
We're building crews and system teams.
And maybe they even dally into the portfolio level with a bit of portfolio planning, a bit of trains, and et cetera, et cetera. But the reality of it is that organisationally, that's why agility has been applied there, because that's the easier place to do it. And so what actually happens with that is we end up with what we call the 3-speed economy. Organisations that apply agility in that way, we've seen it time and time again, end up with the 3-speed economy. And what do I mean by that? So they generally have systems of strategy and leadership heading one way. If they don't have systems of strategy and their leadership going that way, or have a system strategy, that's a different talk than the one we're doing right now, right? And probably needs a whole different set of solutioning. Their systems of work are heading in a different direction. But what they leave behind is their systems of governance and funding. And so they end up with their traditional systems of funding and governance heading one way, systems of strategy and leadership and systems of work protects in different ways. Even worse, what we see is the actual funding and the governance at odds with each other as well. And ultimately that disenables their ability to use their agility. They can't leverage the ability to use the agility that they built into their organization, because it begins to choke the organizational construct. And what I mean by that, to give you a little stark reminder of that, I wanted to put some real proof points around this, and thank heavens that Evan, who wrote the foreword for the book for us, had done some really great research on it. 5 years into their journey. And they actually polled organizations all over the world. To give you an idea of that, the Business Agility Institute's in 76 different countries in the world. So we're not playing in the shallow end of the pool with this data, we're in the deep end of the pool here, right? 5 years. Organizational construct changes how many times within that 5 years? How many times are your teams, streams, pods, squads pulled apart? How often is your VUCA apply and change to your organization, and yet you haven't changed your governing systems? And this is why we have a 3-speed economy, why our agility, we're disenabling our ability to use our agility.
Yeah, Tony likes to drill me on this one. So my role is actually head of transformation for APAC, which is an interesting title. And we start out with a view that we want to, I've only been there for about 6 months, I think 9 months now. So we do have a transformational view, but the interesting thing is we're starting with governance. So other teams are working on systems of operating, systems of work, some of the stuff we're going to talk about as we go along. But my team's focusing on governance first. So how do we govern the system of work? How do we identify it? How do we plan it? How do we trace it? How do we fund it? And how do we connect the execution of it? Because we kind of think that we want to start with that, scale, enable that, and then all the other things will be more successful off the back of it. So we're kind of trying to invert that in the work that we're doing today.
This is the point where I usually say to people, So if your systems are built with that traditional governance and funding, and you have a disconnect between your strategic intent to your delivery and your delivery to your strategic intent, it's what we call the collaborative connective tissues of the organization, the ability to flow information horizontally and vertically to enable you to understand the organization. Then what do you hear? Exactly that, silence. And silence is the sound of risk piling up. So we end up with, everybody knows watermelon, the watermelon project thing, right? We drop the watermelon's nice and green and then we drop it as red. Well, there's actually a further phase of that, which is code brown, and then it hits the fan and everybody's got to run around and spend exorbitant amounts of money to fix the problem. So when we have that built into the system the way it is, then we have a real problem with risk. Phil, your favorite slide?
Oh, no, it's all about risk. So everything about agility is actually about risk management and risk reduction. I think that gets lost a lot in the wash up. So the idea is that if you're rethinking the way you work, you're shortening the batch process of how you operate, you're bringing people closer to it, you're automating, you're actually managing the risk of your delivery. So one of the first things that kind of we always try and do, again, we'll talk about it when we get into this, at least my first thing, is how do you visualize the system, elevate the work, and understand the flow of things that are happening? How do you trace things through the system? Because you're creating transparency and you're stopping that silence. And I think that's a critical first step in anything.
So essentially what we're looking for then is to have our 3 speeds of economy heading in the same direction and the same level of flow. And flow is the big buzzword at the moment, right? But let's be honest, there is no flow without our governing systems moving in the same direction as our strategic leadership and systems of work. You actually hit a complexity ceiling. What you end up doing when you hit that complexity ceiling, and this is what we see organizations that are not addressing their governing systems, is you pay a complexity tax. And that complexity tax is in not just in tens of thousands, in tens of millions when you calculate it, let alone the fact it's not just about money, you're actually paying it in people, in time, and in value delivery. Your ability to link your strategic intent to your delivery and your delivery to your strategic intent is disenabled. And that's what I mean when I say you disenable their ability to use their agility. You need to be able to link all of those systems in the same flow. So we'll talk about that a little bit further in terms of how do we change, because it's easy for us to sit here and poke holes in it, which is what we've been doing for the last
I reckon we're about 25 minutes in, so I think let's talk about the things what we actually do.
Yeah, so let's talk about what we coined the phrase stanchions as our frame. We didn't want to use lens or pillars or
quadrants
and frameworks, so we came up with stanchions. Phil, what the hell is a stanchion?
You can ask me this every time. So when you go to the cinema and you're going in and you see the ropes tied up to the poles, that's the stanchions. It's the things that are guiding you along the pathway that people want you to go. So we kind of took that, went, actually, that's quite interesting, because that's kind of the intent that we're trying to get to when we think about the 5 stanchions that we've got. They're guide rails. So they're supposed to take you in a certain direction. They're not guardrails, which Tony will talk about, but they're guide rails. So how do we sort of chart your course, and they're flexible and they're maneuverable, and when you don't need them, you just take them away. That's kind of the intent behind the stanchion word. And there's a lot of debate around that, but it's going on well so far.
At least people remember it. Okay, so let's talk about the stanchions themselves and what they are. So we came up with them very clearly. And how we distilled these, as we said, we did a lot of research on this, and we kept seeing the repeatable patterns. What we saw, though, was the repeatable patterns of those organizations that we saw that were doing this well. And those organizations that were doing well, these repeatable patterns stood out every single time. So conductive leadership, and we'll talk about why we call it that, sensible transparency, the patterns of work, data-driven reasoning. So you'll notice there's some differences in the wording that we use as opposed to the traditional. And humanity is the cornerstone. So what we'll do is we'll dig a little deeper into these for you. Let's start with conductive leadership. So let me start with the term conductive leadership and leading with intent. So everybody knows the David Marquez or the servant leadership or those sort of things, right? So let me just say, firstly, I hate servant leadership. And I've been doing this thing since 1999, Agile. No leader I have ever worked with wants to be told to be a servant. I don't even like that. I don't even pick up after my kids. I'm not their servant, right?
I do.
Well, that's your problem, bud. But what we want to do is we want to look at changing the way we lead, because when we change the governing systems, we have to change the way that we lead. Because the minute we apply agility to an organization, agility by rote disseminates control. That's what it's meant to do. And that only leaves one other lever, which is command. So you'll hear those, I must, I should, I would, I have to, etc. The other thing we want to do is we want to change that, because too many of our leaders are stuck in execution and not actually enabling and enhancing or steering. They're actually in the mix. So what do we mean by that? So we came up with conductive leadership because it came from a conductor. And you want to be more conducive. And if you look at a conductor, bear with me for a moment, but you'll see the conductor with his lovely stick and you think that that's just a bit of flour. And I always thought that was the case too. But actually, we watched this particular video where it shows that he's making strategic interventions. Phil plays a bum note because that's what I would expect, right? I'll give him a double tap to say, don't do that, and continue on. He'll do it again. And I give him a very violent one to say, please get that right. The actual conductor is making strategic intention. Are you seeing the conductor jump in? Do you see the conductor actually playing the instrument? Do you see the conductor changing it? No. He's enabling and leading with intent. So we want to be more conductive. We want to give that clarity of focus, enable that clarity of focus, that direction of travel, so our people understand the guide rails versus the guardrails. And Phil said I'd talk about that, and I will. Guardrails are those last things of governance that organizations have stacked up over year after year after year. It's an organizational detritus that nobody even knows why they're using those governing systems anymore. And guardrails are actually the things that you hit on a highway. They're your last chance before you go over a cliff. They should be minimal. They should be the things that are quite strong. Guide rails are more like the actual directive system that you use in your cars, which I turn off sometimes, but anyway, which pull you back in and show you the way to go. You know where you need to move within those guide rails, and it's enabling our people to do such. We give them that with that cognizance and responsibility. We talk about that in terms of enable your people, enable the people close in person, place in time, close to where the work gets done by the people who do it at the time it gets done and where it gets done, because they have the knowledge. Not being stuck in execution. The minute you're stuck in execution as a leader, then your intent and your ability to understand what's happening in the governing of the system is disenabled. And that means that takes, a lot of work to encourage collaboration across the organizational construct. Too many times our leaders are siloed, or the organizational construct has enabled them to be siloed, and silos create chasms is the way we talk about that. And when we have that in terms of leadership, then we have leaders stuck in execution. We have teams and organizations that are optimizing for locality, and our governing systems and that collaborative connective tissues are broken. And that disenables their ability to use agility.
Yeah, that's a pivotal one, that collaboration element. I mean, a lot of organizations end up structuring in a way that each leader runs a thing, it runs a function, it runs a business unit, whatever it is. They've got their goals and outcomes, and then to share across those becomes that, but if I give that up, how am I going to hit my goal? That might help you, and it might help the organization, but I'm going to suffer. So collaboration across silos is a really critical, interesting one. You kind of see play out a lot. Sensible transparency, Tony, I love this one. So the whole idea is that how do we elevate work? How do we create visibility? So it's not a factory. Most knowledge work is not a factory anymore. We're working in organizations where you can't see what's going on. You can't see the flow of work. You can't see the decisions that are being made. So I think if you think about how many decisions people would make in a day, think about sort of your standard initiative. So let's say I've got 10 people working in a Scrum team. I'm probably making 10 decisions a day across those 10 people. That's 100 a day. That's directionally leading me in a certain pathway. So if I'm constantly making 100 decisions a day that's sort of taking me a certain direction, is that the right direction I need to be going? So good agile methods will put in sort of place those feedback loops, those checkpoints to make sure that the work's going the direction I need it to go, or I'm going to sort of have to pivot it back again, which is the transparency element. So that idea of transparency is to break down those silos and share information across them, whether they be cross-functional teams or just the ability to coordinate and collaborate differently. But also, transparency is a bit of a double-edged sword. Often it invites blame rather than inquiry. So elevating information can actually be detrimental. So people sometimes have a bit of a fear of that. They don't want to share the things that are going on. They want to keep it inside the box. And I'll just manage the information flow, and I'll manage the communication flow. But without really good transparency across silos, you actually don't get the ability, you don't get agility, because you're slowing your whole organization down. What it also drives is strategic alignment. How do I know I'm heading that idea of Scrum teams making 100 decisions a day? How do I know I'm heading in the right direction? How do I know that this is the right thing I'm working on? It's taking me to the right outcome. So it drives that strategic alignment. The last missing bit is about bi-directional. So it needs to flow both ways. It's not just about me saying, show me all your work. It's also about my team talking to me about your decisions. How are you making your decisions? How do they influence me? How do they make my work better? It actually needs to be a collaborative process as much as everything else.
You notice we use the word sensible transparency, and as Phil noted there, when we started talking with organizations and starting to play the transparency card, a lot of them, and I'm sure that you've all felt that as well, there was lots of things like radical transparency. You've got to be transparent about everything. I've heard Agilists say that many times, right? But the reality of it is within organizational construct of the governing of the entire system, there are some things that can't be shared, right? Just purely because legislative, regulative, et cetera, et cetera. But you can be transparent about what you can't be transparent about. So we talk about sensible transparency rather than having that frame of reference out of saying you guys are all crazy. You just want to throw the bathwater out with the baby, right? The baby.
Yeah, and Dave Snowden talks about a little bit. I don't know if anyone knows Dave Snowden. He built the Cynefin sort of framework and sort of leading through complexity. Full transparency actually reduces competitive advantage and it reduces variability. And actually the cost of getting to full transparency actually exceeds the benefit. So you think about the amount of effort or time you have to put in to get that, it's actually not that valuable. So you've actually got to find that zone or that middle element where you go, it's about the right spot, not too much, not too little. This is helping us move forward.
And I like what you said there, Catherine. We had seen that as many times, right? Transparency inviting criticism, not the constructive kind. So that's the other thing. The other thing, just to sign off on that, because we only have a certain amount of time, but with transparency, it's about designing your transparency sensibly to enable those things that we're talking about, rather than just banging in a system that's going to give transparency or throwing things at the wall that we think is the right thing. It's actually being sensible about it and designing it in the construct of it to provide those things that we need. All right, that brings us to the patterns of work. So you're still going to look at the work layer. We're not saying you shouldn't, right? I said in my 3-speed economy, but you have to look at it in a different way. So the first thing is you can't have an agile governance or governing of agility, as we talk about it, if you don't design for flow. The issue that we have is they only do that with the thought in mind of flow one way, and that's to get the work out, but it's actually flow of information to enable decisioning. So let me give you something that's always been banged into my head by some of you may know. I've worked with Alistair. Both of us have worked with Alistair for a very long time, and the one thing that he's really burned into me is that what is Agile meant to do? And I'll hear lots of things like, make speed faster and you deliver. No, actually, Agile's meant to speed your ability or information flow. It creates information flow so you can make directional decisions. You can make expedient interventions into the system. You can pivot and adapt. So your patterns of work have to be designed for flow, They have to enable you to distribute that decision making so that your information and your decisions flow. That's of optimal importance if you're going to allow your system to have transparency and enable conductive leadership. Your systems have to be designed in that way. And the way to do that is to start by codifying the ways of working and understanding the amount of organizations who really don't understand how their way of working is set up. How do you design that for flow? The other thing is dynamic reteaming. So Heidi Heflin, if you haven't read her book, Dynamic Reteaming, your teams are going to change. The stable, sticky teams mantra that Agile has had for many, many years, the reality of life, universe and organizations is your organizational construct has to adapt and pivot. So we actually take that dynamic reteaming even one step further and say, you're going to be a dynamically adaptive organization. You have to be able to adapt. So dynamic reteaming is a necessity, so you better get good at it. So in your patterns of work, enable yourself to think about how you dynamically reteam, how you codify the ways of working that enable you to distribute that decision-making and design for flow. And again, let me just give you that thing that I want you to take away. I say this every time I do this talk. When I talk about distributing the decision-making, that doesn't mean you give all the decisions. Obviously, if you've read the David Marquet book, he kept the nuclear button to himself because he felt that was harm. Organizational construct is the same. But what we want to do is we want it to be close in person, place in time, closest to the people, where the work gets done at the time the work gets done, who know how the work gets done. But we give them the right guide rails to enable them to make those decisions. So you don't have to be the person that's actually stuck at home, stuck at work rather than being at home making the decisions all the time. Phil, you champion a bit to add something there.
No, I'm not. But anyway, I'll dive in there. So the important part, no, it's really important, like how you set your teams up. We often design, I think, with maybe probably not the most optimized intent. I need to set up a crew in this space. I need to set up a tribe in this space to solve this problem. But when we do that, we can often break the communication flows and the delivery flows that already exist, and we don't solve for those. So we actually end up slowing the system down rather than accelerating it. So when you want to design for flow, codify your ways of working, set up your teaming models, you've generally got to go, well, what's the most independent, isolated patch I can find? Let me start there. And then how do I sort of start to create networks outside of that? And how do I do the next thing? And how do I do the next thing? And how do I do the next thing? But with that total organizational lens, that I want to try to avoid the fracturing of the thing I just did. And you kind of see that time and time again. Bunch of consultants will come in and create your framework and set your team up. They've just broken everything about how your way work and operate, but haven't fixed those connections and patterns. So that overarching view is really critical when you think about designing for flow. Well, we're into data, and this is the one that I love the most. So if you don't have information, it's just an opinion. And that's been a quote, I think it was a Deming quote, I kind of keep referring back to. So the idea about transparency, designing for flow, visualizing and elevating the information we have today on how we're delivering and executing creates transparency, but it gives you information to make better decisions. How many organizations would you go into that say they're digitally driven or we're data driven? But then you say, okay, show me your flow efficiency. Show me your throughput. What'd you commit to last quarter? What'd you deliver to this quarter? And it's usually crickets. We actually don't have that data available. Or if we do, we don't use it for reasoning and decision making. We kind of just have it. Hey, there's a team's elevated it, they've found it. Here's some great information. But do I then make my next planning decisions based on that information? Invariably not. So the idea between data is that, and you think about, COVID's probably been an amazing accelerator for the creation, adoption, and just improvement of digital tools and how we do workflow management. So I think, again, so the organization, so Bupa, where I am today, we made the announcement this week that we're going to PlanView. So, but we're integrating it to ADO. So we're getting a full integrated digital tool set. So I can trace work from the time it starts to the time it's in the customer's hands. And digital workflow solutions will do that today. So without that, I think you actually can't have agility. You actually need that tooling in place so you can get clarity of the work at an organizational level. And that allows you to fight opinions. So you can come in with the facts. Yeah, we're going into planning. Yeah, we think we can start about 40 initiatives. Well, I've got a data item that tells you you're going to deliver 10. Do you really want to start 40? So you can actually have those conversations, limit the amount of work that's coming through the system, get more out at the end. And I think you improve the way that you work and operate. So off the back of that, though, without data, you can't improve. What are you improving against? So I think, Tony, you've got a great background in lean. This all comes from lean thinking. So where are we today? PDCA cycles. Where am I starting? What's the current condition? What's the target condition? What do I need to do to take me to that? How do I know that I'm actually better? Good workflow management systems, good data allow you to actually improve measurably and visibly, which solves part of your organizational question. We get a leader that goes, yeah, I want to do Agile, but show me how you're getting better. Well, great, here's some data. And look at that, we're 10% better this quarter. They're the things you want to be able to elevate. And I think also without data, you can't get those directional decisions. You don't know where you're going. What have we done today? Because if you don't know where you've been, you don't know where you're going. So I kind of think that's the basis to project yourself into the future. So it also allows you to move the bane of estimation. How big a problem is estimation? No matter where you go, it's always a challenge. With good data tools, good historical information, you don't need estimation anymore. You're actually forecasting. And that's a massive shift away from what we maybe have done in the past. And data enables that. It enables your governance. It enables your governing systems.
And that's why we call it data-driven reasoning. Yeah. So we leverage the thought of data-driven reasoning off two points. Everything that Phil said, of course, but the lean method of, if you want to make fact-based decisions, you have to have data. To have data, you have to measure the right things. The second one is the heart of Agile, and you heard me talk about it before. If you have transparency and collaboration, that enables you then to change your leadership. That also allows you to make directional decisions, but you actually have to then retrospect, reflect, whatever you like, take that data, and you need to reason against it. The data doesn't lie, but people do use data to lie, and maybe not intentionally, but you have to reason against that data. So that's how we tie the bow on that. And I'll move forward with that because I know we're running low on time. We can talk for hours on this stuff. So humanity is the cornerstone of that, and you know, you can tell that we've been schooled by Alistair Coker, because when we got him to review the book, he actually practiced pretty hard and said, "Where's the people?" We knew that, but it was actually worthy of actually coming up with an actual intent to that when we use this frame of reference around organizations, is thinking about the humanity piece. And I'll move through it reasonably quickly because we've tied some of that in, but it's actually focusing on autonomy. It's easy to say, not so much easy to do in organizations, but it is focusing on giving the people the autonomy to do that by setting in place the right guardrails, setting in place the right trust, transparency, and conductive leadership rather than that command and control traditional type leadership, giving them the patterns of work and the data that enables them to get where they need to go, providing with the trust to the people, giving them responsibility and accountability, remembering the Christopher Avery thing, they're two different things, right? What are they responsible for? What are they accountable for? What are the leaders responsible for? What are they accountable for? And often we see that in organizations that's not clear. And the last piece of that we look at is, we're not saying, again, and you heard me say, you know, throw the baby out with the bathwater type thing. We're not saying we're going to set the inmates free here, okay, to use a terrible term, but you know, we want to scale down the mechanistic controls. However, that does mean we still need to think about how we understand what's happening and what's happening in the work. And to use this, it's one of Phil's favourite sayings, but it comes from the Reagan administration. It was a Russian proverb, but we don't use the Russian version of it for obvious reasons.
No, not anymore.
But the intent is still great. It's trust, but verify. We trust you to do the work. We trust you to enable, but we still need to verify what we're doing, how we're doing, to make sure we're working on the right things at the right time, in the right place, at the right speed. So that's the 5 stanchions. I like to use this when we talk about, it's Phil's favourite quote, and I'll let
My favourite quote.
I'll let him talk to it because it is his favourite quote.
It is my favourite quote because the whole idea of agility is about performance. It's about predictability. It's about getting to outcomes better. It's about people being more engaged in their work. So there's a bunch of the benefits are there, like better delivery. When you look at all the Standish reports and version 1 reports about sort of agile delivery systems versus non-agile delivery systems, they're generally twice as good based on the data that's there. But if you don't actually think about the governing system and trying to inject agility to allow agility to thrive in the organization, you're basically buying the Ferrari and you're stuck in first gear. You're not allowing yourself to get the efficiency, the effectiveness, or the value that you might see from making a transformation. You constrain yourself and you hold yourself back.
So I see that, and I will answer that, Will. That's a great question.
I'm typing now.
Yeah, typing, but I will.
Typing and talking, multitasking.
We'll verbally answer that as well. And I know the 5 stanchions, somebody said to me when I was doing this talk a little while ago, I said, well, they're pretty obvious and they're not rocket science. And my answer to that person was, but is your organization doing all of those at the same time in concert? That silence is the answer that I get every time I talk to executives and I talk to executive teams, I talk to governing systems, is that frame of reference, those 5 stanchions actually enable a conversation and a frame of reference that we haven't had before. Maybe you have, but we found that this allows us to talk to organizations. And as we look at those layers of those stanchions, we're able to actually provide interventions and solutioning against those frames of reference. And Phil and I have done this in a number of different organizations. I'm working with 3 large ones where, we changed their operating systems. I said to them, you need to do your governing systems. They said, no, we'll get to that. 2 weeks later, I had the CIO on the phone to me saying, it's choking the daylights out of me. I need you back here. We use these frame of reference. We redesigned their governing systems in 2 days. We know that it works. There's a lot more in depth in the book because I think you probably think it was a bit shallow, but that's as much as we can cram from a 276 page into a small event like this. So I think our closing thought, and then we'll answer some questions, is don't apply governance to your agile. Apply agility to your governance. So I'm going to